Hello, I'd like to thank you for joining me in this brief presentation. My name is Brandon Vickers, and I'm going to be discussing issues with communication among adults with autism. There are millions of Americans who have various types of disabilities. Millions more family members of people with disabilities also have their lives dramatically impacted by these conditions. I have experienced this personally as a parent of a child with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. ASD is a developmental disorder which can be diagnosed in children as early as 2 years of age. It can present symptoms in many ways, resulting in levels of disability in individuals varying from mild to severe, thus the term spectrum. Per research conducted by the CDC, about 1 in 68 children will be diagnosed with ASD. The nonprofit organization Advancing Futures for Adults with Autism states that an estimated 1.5 million people in the United States are living on the autism spectrum, and that number is expected to increase. As the number of adults with ASD increases, so too will the issues with interability communication in this population. In this paper, I will address several issues with communication faced by adults with autism. I will discuss the language barriers to consider, labeling of individuals with autism, including person-first language, and public policy decisions that affect this population. ASD manifests itself in different ways in individuals. One of the typical characteristics is, per the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, difficulty in understanding and expressing language as used in typical communication, both verbal and nonverbal. This type of impairment can cause problems for these individuals when attempting to interact with neurologically typical peers. An example of the type of problems that can arise became a part of the news recently. A man with a severe ASD disability recently escaped from an assisted care facility where he lived. He wandered to a nearby neighborhood carrying a toy with him. A neighborhood resident saw the man and notified police, reporting a man behaving erratically and possibly carrying a handgun. The man's behavior therapist from the facility located him, and police arrived shortly thereafter. When the police arrived, they attempted to get the disabled man to comply with their commands, and they mistook the toy in his hand for a weapon. Despite pleas from the therapist that the man did not understand their commands, police opened fire, striking the therapist in the leg with a bullet. The police who responded to this call handled the situation improperly. Clearly, further training needs to be held with law enforcement on how to properly deal with a situation involving an individual with a disability which impacts his or her ability to communicate. Had this man not had a caretaker with him to communicate for him and, unfortunately, take a bullet for him, there's a high likelihood that this man would have been seriously injured or even killed by police. Often, individuals with ASD may not appear to have a disability at all, so this can present itself as a barrier to communication. If a disability is not apparent to someone dealing with an individual with ASD, they may not understand why the person is not responding to their words in the typical manner. Another issue with communication facing those with ASD is one of terminology and language used when referring to individuals with this disability. As mentioned above, there are individuals who are on the autism spectrum that range from very severe symptoms such as a complete lack of ability to communicate. On the other end of the spectrum, there are many people who have only mild symptoms and are considered high functioning. Person-first language is something that is frequently discussed among disabled people and their advocates. Often it is stressed that when addressing people who have conditions, such as ASD, that they not be referred to with labels that put the disability in a position of emphasis over the identity of the person. People want to be referred to as who they are and not what condition they have. This is a point of contention among those in the autism community. The conventional wisdom would be that one should refer to them as people with ASD or person who has autism instead of autistic. It would seem by calling someone autistic, you are putting the fact that they have autism ahead of their identity as a person. Per the people at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, this is not entirely true. ASAN is a group comprised of people who are largely high-functioning members of the autism community who work to advocate on their own behalf and for others who have the same condition. They have spoken out in favor of the use of the term autistic. They believe that being autistic is as much a part of who they are as any other aspect of their identity. They believe that the condition is something that makes them unique, and they embrace it rather than shun the label. It has been said that people with a condition like ASD do not have something, as those who have something can somehow get rid of it or change it and no longer have it, while ASD is not something they can discard, as it is a lifelong disorder. Still, there are others who do advocate for the person-first model. They believe that the term autistic has taken on a negative connotation, much like the term retarded and other similar terms that have been used as derogatory. The lesson to be learned here is that these labels that we use to identify people should be used according to the person being spoken about and or written about. In my research, I found enough evidence to support the idea that the terms person with autism and autistic can be used interchangeably in most situations. Person-first language has been used for many years when speaking about people with innumerable conditions. The idea was assumed to pertain to the ASD community as well, and many people assumed that this was the proper way to refer to them. People who have ASD and consider themselves to be autistic spoke out about what terms they preferred. This brings up another issue with communication among this population. It seems that often decisions are made without ever actually consulting the people who are affected. With the rising number of ASD individuals in the United States, there are many conversations taking place about their needs and how to best handle them in the public sector. The problem is that these conversations are still being held without including them even when things affect them greatly. We need to ensure that policymakers, as they are dealing with the rising costs of the prevalence of autism, are inclusive in their decision-making process. Currently, autism costs the United States economy approximately $268 billion. If the number of autism diagnoses continues through 2025, experts predict that costs will exceed $1 trillion. It is only logical to assume that as the number of ASD cases rises, so too will the number of people with a high-functioning level on the spectrum. These people will be increasingly available to advocate on the behalf of individuals with the same disability. With the cost of the economy in caring for this community, there will undoubtedly be increases in policies which affect them directly. Including these self-advocates in these decision-making processes will only help to reduce barriers to communication moving forward. The issues facing persons with disabilities are great. The individuals must overcome numerous challenges daily. People on the autism spectrum are no different. It is important to remove as many barriers to this communication as possible. By increasing our training on special needs communications with first responders, ensuring we try to use labels based on individual preference when possible, and being inclusive in policymaking, we can help make our society work for everyone. This concludes this brief presentation. Thank you for joining me.